in 3 major public theater schools in Poland, and now we have this great opportunity to catch the international perspective and actually to continue the discussion we had. So there will be also time for question and answers, and I think the conversation is the clue of the situation. But first we'll have presentations. I would like to welcome our great guests, and it's Kim Meyer, Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Manager from Royal Central School of Speech and Drama in London, Broderick Chow, Reader and Director of Learning, Teaching and Inclusion, also from Royal Central School of Speech and Drama in London, Peter Polak, ombudsperson at the Theatre Faculty on the Academy of Performing Arts in Prague, and Olivia Grecia from Babeș University from Romania. So as I said, first we'll have a round of presentation and then we'll enter to the discussion. So I would like to give the floor to Kim Myers now.
Thank you. So yes, my name's Kim Myers. My pronouns are she, her. I am the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Manager at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama in London. This was a newly created role at Central in August 2021, which is when I joined. For context, I will be using the term global majority to refer to people not racialised as white. This is because globally we are in fact not a minority, and it is important to use language that is empowering. Most people would like to think they are not racist or do not demonstrate or enable racism or classism within their daily lives or professional practices. Within inclusion work, it is vital that drama and theatre school consider the differences between belonging and fitting in. This panel is about changes in European drama and theatre schools, and I feel that when discussing this, it is crucial to consider palatability. This is something that screams out to me as someone who has navigated many elitist drama school environments through different lenses, be it class, race, as a potential student, and working professional over the years. But palatability is not something I have heard people discuss really at all within drama schools. So, what is palatability? The Britannica Dictionary describes palatability as being pleasant or acceptable to someone. This is extremely subjective, of course, and the danger of not having diversity within decision-making panels and influential roles in drama schools is that a single set of people tend to make decisions around what they feel more comfortable and familiar with. Palatability cultivates an oppressive environment and speaks to the idea of people being less than and othered. Quite simply, palatability centres whiteness. Drama schools probably often fail to realise they are asking students to be palatable, but if we look at the language used, the top drama schools will often say they look for the best. And what does that mean? It certainly means different things to different people. For instance, someone from the local housing estate may not have had the opportunity for one-to-one drama coaching or as much proximity to theatre. But because of the language used, that being best, they may not even want to apply. That does not mean they're not good enough. However, people from underrepresented backgrounds understand what is implied in these spaces, that they are considered as less than. They have the weight of all of this on their shoulders before even getting through the door. Before I tell you about what we do at Central, I will begin with the why for me. Over a decade ago, I decided to train as an actor. At most drama school auditions, I found myself being the only black woman, sometimes the only black person in the room. Everyone appeared to be a carbon copy of each other, from very similar, very white, very wealthy backgrounds. I noticed that they exuded an air of confidence that I personally had never seen in one place at the same time. From the many conversations I could overhear, they didn't doubt for 1 second that they belonged there. I felt completely like a fish out of water. I had discomfort and anxiety running through my body just from the environment alone. As I auditioned in various schools, I think 6 in total, I realised why there weren't more people that looked like me auditioning. This wasn't an inviting space for us. Everyone seemed to have claimed the space as their own, and I couldn't do that. The extra pressure on top of having to audition, often in front of a completely white panel and fellow auditionees, felt widely and disproportionately unfair. I had all sorts of thoughts in my mind, such as, would they even understand or be interested in my take on this classical monologue? My modern piece was incredibly cultural and centred around my own identity. Would that go against me, I thought. At one particular audition recall, a very confident, and I'm going to massively generalise here, posh white guy, who I had heard boasting to others about his jaunts in Chelsea and King's Road, and for anyone unaware, these are some of the richest areas of London. Well, this guy was part of my group. The two of us were doing improv together. The audition was actually going well. We had a strong energy and dynamic between us. I was really feeling confident that I was doing well until he turned to me and said, as part of the improv, "What are you even doing here?" It was so out of context, but I shrugged it off and carried on. However, he stopped me in my tracks again when he said, "Look around. No one else looks like you. Why are you even here?" I remember he seemed really pleased with himself for saying that. My stomach sunk. I knew exactly what he meant. I looked around the room, and people appeared visibly uncomfortable. Although I already knew what was happening, in these moments we often tend to need reassurance that we have read the situation correctly. I got that from the looks glaring uncomfortably back at me. I looked at the panel, expecting them to intervene. They just looked embarrassed, began shuffling, and clearly didn't know what to do. I got on with the audition, and we struggled through the last part of the improv, but my mind was elsewhere after that. Neither of us got recalled, unsurprisingly. I went home and cried that night about the fact that I let him get to me and the fact that the panel allowed it to continue. One thing I wasn't upset about was that I didn't get in to train at that school. Now, I share this story because I feel it's important to give a backstory, as often this work has more impact when experiences are humanised. Years later, after a decade of working in HR and inclusion spaces, I decided that I wanted to work in a space where I was actively reducing and eventually eliminating the systemic harm in drama schools. I wanted to contribute to the change that I knew was needed. At Central, we aim to lead by meeting staff and students where they are, because self-esteem is the core of success in so many areas of life, work, relationships, everything. If we destroy this in our global majority students when they come to study with us, where does that leave them? Drama schools need to understand the additional burden for racialized students on top of education and training. We try to go beyond policy, process, and compliancy to a personable, meaningful interaction, where impacted students feel held, heard, and seen. Some of this work at Central includes staff and student mandatory anti-racism training around anti-racist practice and allyship. This was developed by Dr. Muna Abdi and coordinated by our Programme Leader for Learning, Development and Inclusion. At times when incidents have unfortunately occurred at Central, I have taken groups involved aside for informal intervention with the permission of the impacted students. I sit with the whole group and discuss microaggressions, decentering whiteness, impacts of harmful behaviours towards peers, and conclude with lessons learned. These have proven to be extremely effective and have offered education, transparency, and removed some of the burden from the students impacted. Students have reported that they gained an understanding of their own behaviours that they were not even aware of. The groups have been able to work together without continuing the same harmful patterns of behaviour following this. We've also had events highlighting the historical contributions from underrepresented communities at Central. These have been led by our principal, Josette Bushell-Mingo, and the team. The first event was Black Presence at the Embassy, which included a digital archive of material celebrating Black history at Central's Embassy Theatre. The next event will focus on Jewish histories and cultures at Central. During the first event, the empowerment within the Black students was clear, just from the jubilance and high energy. They were able to celebrate themselves unapologetically. I believe this created the start of a long overdue and much needed shift in culture for Central. We have looked at our staff demographics and set measurable targets to improve workforce diversity within our hiring processes. We have a workforce diversity working group that feeds into our inclusion committee, blind recruitment shortlisting for professional services, the requirement for a diverse EDI profile as part of shortlisting, applying positive action where necessary, advertising with recruitment agencies that specialise in diverse recruitment, and diversifying our Board of Governors membership. I recently worked with our wardrobe manager to complete a screening process for hiring theatre hair and makeup artists to work on our shows. The purpose of this was to target trusted professionals with strong experience and a positive attitude towards working with afro hair and darker skin complexions. This has resulted in a very diverse pool of visiting lecturers to work specifically on this. Last year, I launched alongside Human Resources our first staff survey in order to hear and understand people's experiences of working at Central and to start to be able to measure feedback. We have been discussing anti-Semitism as part of our anti-racism rhetoric. Chavura was founded in 2022 by colleagues and a student. It is a voluntary Jewish celebratory community of friendship and fellowship, open to staff and students. Jewish staff and students have since reported that this is the first time they have been able to discuss anti-Semitism openly at Central. We delivered mandatory staff training, and we're consulting alongside Jewish staff and students in regards to adopting Central's anti-Semitism definition. There is ongoing work around all of this. These are a few notable areas of our inclusion work, but through all of this, I will say that proactive work is incredibly important, which is why culture should be prioritised. Once the harm is done, the trauma has already set in. My experience is a good example of that. Central has come a long way from the Dear White Central open letter that you will hear more about later today from Dr. Broderick Chow, but we still have a long, long way to go. I would like to give my final thoughts over to Toni Morrison, who said, the The very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language, and you spend 20 years proving that you do. Somebody says your head isn't shaped properly, so you have scientists working on the fact that it is. Somebody says you have no art, so you dredge that up. Somebody says you have no kingdoms, so you dredge that up. None of this is necessary. There will always be one more thing. So I encourage everyone to consider introspectively whether you unknowingly expect palatability when going about your work practices alongside colleagues or students of the global majority and other underrepresented backgrounds. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kim, for that. I'm very delighted to be in fellowship and community with you all today. My name is Dr. Broderick Chow. I also work at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama with Kim. To position myself first, I'm an East and Southeast Asian man. My pronouns are he, him. My background is mixed Chinese and Filipino heritage. I'm an immigrant to the UK. I was raised as a settler in Canada of immigrant parents on the unceded land of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, and which most people now know as Vancouver, Canada. I want to start by positioning myself in that way because what I want to speak to you today about, at least in this panel right now, and I will be presenting later at 6 p.m. on something very different, but I want to focus on relations and their importance in learning and teaching. Relations are central to Indigenous life and knowledge, and they are not the same as the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate scholar Kim Tallbear says. They're not the same as identity. Identity does not equal relation. In other words, you do not understand who you are without understanding who are you in relation to. So why is this important? Well, when we enter into any theater school campus, whether it is here at the Academia or if it's central, we are immediately placed in relation with each other, with nearly, in the case of central, nearly 1,200 students, 150 faculty, 400 to 500 visiting lecturers, professional services staff, visitors, and in relation to our university structures, our industries, the history, the state, the history of colonialism in our country, and Europe and all of its colonial relations to the rest of the world today. So this is who we are in relation with. But when we go and do theater, when we make theater, so much of what we do is about presenting relations on stage, whether on a social level, in the naturalistic theater, or in physical theater between bodies in an expressive way, or between bodies and objects and non-human actors and so on. And in doing so, we need to think about what these relations are characterized by. They're characterized by many things in the theater: power, violence, extraction. So often those are relations at the heart of drama because they're about conflict. Conversely, we need to consider relations of care, friendship, and love. That's what makes what we do in the theater political in so many ways. But what we forget is that individuals are going to experience these relations very differently based on their identities, because although identity is not the same as relation, identity is central to relation. Individuals, our students, our faculty, whoever in our communities, are going to experience the relations of our communities in different ways based on their positionality, how they are positioned in the world. And I think that considering this can be very difficult for some of our traditional forms of theater training. I don't know if this comes across the same way in Polish as a language, nor in other languages, in other European languages, and it certainly might not in other non-European languages. But the word training is very interesting in its usage in theater schools. So consider that what we train, right? So we train horses, dogs, and actors. but we study English or biology or math, you know. And that French term "entraîner," it means like to follow something, to follow a process. So this conception of training is a very particular relation, and I think in other, earlier in the day, I was really struck by the phrase master-disciple relationship. And that's, I think, what characterizes a lot of training today. And so this relation, this one-way relation of training as one person, the trainer shaping or molding another person, is really similar to what the radical educationalist Paulo Freire called the banking model of education, where there is someone with the knowledge that transmits that knowledge into the student who is the empty vessel. At the same time, I think in my own research over the past 10, 15 years, I've always tried to challenge this passive construction of training. A lot of my research is interested in sports and performance, and I'm often the subject of that training in my research. And so I think about the trained and training body is also a thinking body. The body in training is also constantly encountering a series of techniques, new knowledge, embodied engagement, and this relation of difference, how one individual body encounters a whole field of knowledge, and technique for me is knowledge, that always happens. That produces the site of learning. It's impossible not to. So the difficulty happens, I think, when we as teachers don't pay attention to our own relations in the space, how our own positionality shapes the things that we do, our processes of training, the expectations that we have of students, our techniques and practices. So to turn this, I think, to the, you know, some of the key words in the field at the moment, a decolonized theater training needs to look beyond just simply diversifying and simply adding something to a curriculum to consider more fundamental models and more fundamental questions about how we teach. And it needs to be shaped by relations, our relevance to our communities, our people today. So at Central, what I, in my role, have been trying to implement is a teaching philosophy at the school that, you know, simply boils down into thinking about some key questions about positionality, relation, and consent. Or in simple language, some fundamental questions: who am I, and how does my identity relate to others? Therefore, how do I work, live, and create with others? And how do I negotiate my boundaries and those of others? So at the very beginning, theater and performance fundamentally starts with the self, but that self always in relation to everyone else. We bring ourselves and our identities to everything we do and make in theater, which means sometimes that question of how I encounter a particular character, play, design, choreography, technical practice, or concept is going to be a very complex and challenging one. And it's our responsibility as teachers to make sure that that dialogue, that dialogic model of teaching happens. So in thinking about the dialogic teaching, we are then thinking about relations, because we are representing the world the way it is and how we want it to be. And also, we are thinking about relations because theater is fundamentally collaborative. So it's understanding those relations is important to understanding who it is that make up the we of an ensemble, company, institution, city, or world. When we say we at Central, I mean, who do we mean by that? Who is included in that we? And who's being addressed by that? And then finally, consent is at the heart of ethics in the theater, because it is only through, and this came up quite a lot in that first panel, it's only through informed consent that everybody can fully be empowered to participate in an activity. And I think that question of informed consent is really important in teaching practice, just as like a very high-level ethical question, because it then defines everything else. So if, for example, if we think about access and disability, if somebody does not have the fundamental information in order to make a decision about a assessment, for example, then that assessment is no longer consensual. So in thinking about consent, relation, and identity, I think for me, everything else falls out underneath that. I'm sure there will be more time in the questions to reflect on these things, but that's what I wanted to finish with, is thinking about those key questions about who am I, what are my relations to the others, and how do I negotiate my boundaries and those of others, which I think what's been really lovely to see this morning is how schools in Poland are thinking about that, and how I think schools across Europe are thinking about it right now. And thank you for having us here.
Well, good afternoon. I'm the only one who has PowerPoint, so I think that most of you didn't have a coffee, so I will just bring you the joy with the PowerPoint slides. There are only 10. You are seeing the first one. I will also tell a bit overview of how I became an ombudsperson at the theater faculty. Actually, I studied 3 years of history and theater, history of theater in the university. I got a bachelor's degree. I also studied master's degree of Spanish language and literature, and also got a degree from law. And I started to work in the Office of the Public Defender of Rights in the Czech Republic, and somehow I became the head of Division of Equal Treatment. So I spent approximately 10 years working on non-discrimination issues in the Czech Republic, handling complaints, making surveys, providing recommendations to policymakers and business enterprises, etc. So then I get tired. I started to work on the lower position on disability rights, and it was back in 2021 when the ombudsperson of the film and television faculty, which is the sister faculty of theater faculty in Prague, came to me and asked me, "Hey Peter, we are looking for someone who could do the position of the ombudsperson at the theater faculty." And I say, "No way, never ever." Then there was another round of calls because the first elections were not successful, so I applied and I got elected. So I started to work as an ombudsperson last May, and I'm here to tell the story how DAMU is evolving since that. When I spoke to Kashal, it was like 3 months ago, so she asked me to talk about a bit of political context, because not everyone is familiar with the Czech Republic at all, and societal context, and what's happening at DAMU, what is the response, etc. So, and you have approximately 15 or 20 minutes. I was like, oh my God, just in 20 minutes. So here are my reflections on what is happening. And yeah, I had to acknowledge that I really have this legal background, because I was thinking, why is it not working? Why will we start with the gender-related issues here in the Czech Republic, in Poland, in Romania, and other post-Soviet countries? Why is it not working? So what are the roots of the failure to address discriminatory practices? So first, I think what we share here in the Central and Eastern Europe is this ideological disruption during the socialism. We spent approximately 40 years without not following the discourse, the political discourse and human rights discourse, feminist discourse, which was happening in the Western countries. So there is absolutely no understanding of what is the difference between formal equality and substantive equality in our countries. And that makes a lot of impact when you start to work on anti-discrimination in different public institutions and private ones as well. So another, I think, the root, which is deeply embedded in the Czech Republic, it's this discourse of neoliberalism of early 90s. The former president Václav Klaus and the prime minister was one of the big, the champion in this in this philosophy, I would say, on this view of how the world works. So it means that maximum accent is put on the freedoms, absolute freedom, artistic freedom, entrepreneur's freedom, freedom of choices without any boundaries. So this is what is still very, very present when you start working on this subject in the Czech Republic. And of course, what we inherited from the communism is the lack of trust into law, because law is not a safeguard at all, and this mistrust in state institutions. So whatever comes from the public institutions, from the state, is quite suspicious, and we rather than use it as a tool. And maybe we can talk about it later or during the coffee break, this so-called, I call it Euroscepticism. So because anti-discrimination law is something what we had to implement when we accessed the EU, and it was something which was framed by our politicians as something which is artificial, which doesn't belong to our culture and our society. So there's sometimes, or on a regular basis, we feel that there's sometimes a hysterical reaction with regard to EU law, body of law, and anti-discrimination legislation, especially. So some bits from the political context, and I'm mentioning that because I want to explain why this change was produced at the DAMU. It has some explanation, it's my theory, so maybe some Czech compatriots would not agree, but I think it's good to remember the past, the recent past, because we had, for 4 years, we had a minority government presided by populist leader Andrej Babiš, who's very famous for his controversies with the EU law and conflict of interest, etc. And this minority government was supported by communists, by radical right-wing party, and social democrats. Then we had another guy who is not president of the Czech Republic anymore, but he spent in his term of his Miloš Zeman 10 years, which is 1 decade, which also had a significant impact on how we perceive minorities, how we perceive gender-related issues. So this former president was very amicable to authoritarian regimes like China and Russia Federation, and he repeatedly were very hostile towards minorities and his political opponents in general. So main focus was put on economical issues, and there was no visible change in the field of equality and non-discrimination. I was seeing, working in the Office of the Public Defender of Rights, that there is no progress, even at societal level or political level or legal level, let's say. Yes. So, but luckily, we have a lot of research done in academia in the Czech Republic, and a lot of successful stories coming from the NGOs who were working, the people were working on the issues, and they were showing the inequalities, the increasing inequalities in housing, healthcare, education, employment market. Especially during the COVID pandemic, these things became clear. The burden of women as household keepers was quite significant during the COVID-19 pandemic. The mental health issues were quite visible. And this also explains why the people do not report the incidents, the discrimination at all in the Czech Republic. The level of the reporting is very low. And if there is a case, and if there is a successful case before the court, and there's a victim of discrimination, and there's an article, and there's a heated debate about it. So there's a so-called doctrine of few bad apples, like it's an exception. It doesn't happen so often. So this tendency to deny that there is a problem, there's a structural problem, a systematic problem, it's quite widespread in the discourse. And comparing to Poland, for instance, the vast majority of the Czech population is agnostic or atheist. So this is quite interesting when we see the discussion surrounding the Equal Marriage Act in the Czech Republic, or the ratification of so-called Istanbul Convention, whose main target is to end the gender-based violence. So it's quite surprising that the discourse is certainly very, I would say, colored by the discourse which we could compare to church discourse, or from very conservative environment. So, and these people always say to us in the media that existing laws are objective and they're neutral, which is not true, of course, because it was legislated by someone who was in the power in that time, and it's still in the power. And the new gender progressive regulations of social relations is an unacceptable interference with the natural social order. This is what we hear a lot in the Czech Republic. So this is the societal context before the event I'm happy that happened in Damov. So it was back in June of 2021 when the group of students at the theater faculty made a, let's say, the performance in front of the doors of the theater faculty in Prague, which was recorded. And basically, they did a survey. They collected opinions and experiences from the people who were studying at theater faculty in Prague and also another theater faculty which is based in Brno. And they just read it. They read it out. They spoke out. They read all these testimonies. And it was, as I said, it was recorded, it was put on YouTube, it has a lot of hits, and it has a lot of media coverage. So we heard the stories about denigration of women, about misuse of confidential information, psychological pressure, excessive workload of students, and abuse of power. And the main theme of this initiative, of this grassroots initiative, which is called You Don't Have to Endure It, these are power relations. So, and then many cases started appearing in the media in the different universities of the Czech Republic. So we have cases at Charles University of rape, of sexual violence. We have also a lot of cases in other universities. And we also have very important cases concerning very important man in the Czech Republic who misused its power. One of these was a very young and famous politician, MP, actually MP, who was accused of rape. He was quite, and now he faced charges and there's an ongoing criminal trial with him. So, and there's another one who's called Jan Simický, who was a famous psychiatrician who was accused to rape approximately 30 women during his career of 20 years. So these things started to appear in last couple of years, like starting 2021, 2022. And it also has a cultural impact, which is very interesting, that already the Czech television in so very short time made 2 TV series concerning the misuse of power in academia, or the problems that victims of gender-based violence face, this definition of violations which is not in line with the Istanbul Convention, so the concept of consent is now subject of the public heated debate in the parliament because we need to amend the criminal code. There's also a very interesting performance lecture about fears, who was prepared by the vice dean of the theater faculty, Alice Koubová, and it's very interesting to speak out about your fears when you create, when you are an artist and you are faced with some hostile environment. Contemporary drama, you can see the poster, it was done by Marek Shindelka. It is now in the National Theatre of Brno, and it's sold out. It's very popular, and the funny thing is about it that the actors and actresses in this particular drama or in this particular production are the same who were living the initiative 2 years ago. So they are telling their own story, and of course there's also like heated debate and the criticism that some things could be done differently, but I think it's very important this is happening and it has clear cultural impact in the theater environment in the Czech Republic. And last but not least, there's also a documentary movie about how people are admitted in the art schools, in the University of Fine Arts in Prague, Art Talent Show, which is very good. And the last documentary movie was just presented 2 weeks ago. It's called After the Silence Was Broken, and it's about the former student of DAMU, of the theater faculty, who became actually a star because she was invited to speak about her experience at DAMU to many, many interviews, and she was very, very well known, but somehow she suffered a mental health distress because of such a pressure which was put on her. So this is right now what is happening, and what is the immediate institutional response of my institution, of the theater faculty. So here we have some points which were introduced after the initiative. So first of all, there is now regular psychological support to students. The faculty pays free interventions, first free interventions. So there's an open platform, Let's Share DAMU, so everyone can attend, and professors, lecturers, students can come and speak together with the dean and vice deans of the faculty. The very important thing was the change of internal regulation, because there were people who were heads of departments for more than 15, 20 or 30 years. So now the rule is twice was enough. So if you are appointed as a head of the department at the theater faculty for a second time, it's your last time, and you have to really make a space to another one. So this is very, very important. Establishment of ombudsperson, who works and who handles complaints for students and employees, so that's me, and also the handbook for first-year students and guidance days. So everyone who enters the faculty sees me, sees psychologists, and we have an open talk about what is harassment, what is discrimination, how they can report incidents, etc. So what's next? I get inspired by the recent survey of the project UNICEF, which was presented last year in November. It was the large EU-scale survey in academia, whose fundamental aim was to measure the prevalence of gender-based violence in academia. So, and this project came up with the model of 7P, which means prevalence, prevention, protection, prosecution, provision of services, partnerships, and policies. These are the topics or themes which I'm paying attention to when I'm drafting all these activities in the theater of faculty, just beyond gender-based violence. So I'm also addressing the issues of racial inequalities, disability, ageism, etc. So now we are, I'm implementing the plan of activities. This is the picture from the workshop which happened in January. It was the first workshop ever on prevention of sexual harassment in academia, and all heads of departments and the deans and dean and vice deans attended. So it was very successful, and then we will have a follow-up because they want to resolve more complex case studies. My activities are targeted to students, pedagogues, other employees, people in decision-making positions, and they have forms of workshops, surveys, group discussions, and peer support. Themes are what Dr. Broderick said, like well-being, who am I, how do I cope with the environment, how do I cope with the issue of power, etc. Respectful feedback is very important, and this workshop is very successful. Sexual violence, mental health, hazing, etc. So this is the current situation at DAMU. So we are in the process, in a transformative change. I'm very happy to be part of it, and thank you for your attention. And
hello, I'm very happy to be here. I will be representing faculty from Romania, and as I was telling Agata before the beginning of this panel, we are in a way way behind, I think, than any one of you. Also, in addressing issues such as the issue of student well-being, first of all, and the fact that it even became an issue for the faculty that I'm working for, which is a faculty inside of a university, so this is different than this academy. We have a national university that is based in Bucharest, and I come from Cluj, from Transylvania, and the Faculty of Theatre and Film is part of a larger university called University Babes-Bolyai. I'm not sure this is relevant in a way, because the Bucharest University somehow addressed the issue of abuse, let's say, somewhat similarly. And I find it sad, in a way, that for you here and also in the presentation about DAMU, there was this point of a grassroots activity of students becoming involved and somehow starting this process. Unfortunately, in my case, it was more of a media scandal that somehow made it necessary for the faculty to create a working group. We do not have a special position for this, so I am part of a working group that is called Ethics and Academic Integrity. And it was created last year in the summer because previously there was an independent arts venue that I also work with as a director that actually made a performance based on a series of interviews with alumni and students of theater schools in Romania. It was a musical about abuse in vocational universities. And besides that, they did a campaign, an awareness campaign. They produced 3 videos that they distributed, of course, online. And following that, there were some media investigations, one especially targeting one of the acting teachers of the faculty. Yes, and basically there were some materials that became public, and the faculty needed to respond to this in a way. So this is how the working group Ethics and Academic Integrity came to be. Yes, why only now? What were the specifics of this person's abusive behavior? Because we use the word abuse, which is a very strong one. We do not have an equivalent for hazing in Romania, so there's always a talk inside the group of what is an abuse and how do we frame this term so that it is not triggering and it does not create backlash from the teachers. And sometimes we use other notions such as inadequate behavior, things like that. But essentially, that this person, this teacher that I'm talking about, was abusive in many ways. And he came to be actually excluded from the university because a group of 5 female students actually created a collective, let's say, petition. They went to talk to one of the university staff and they invoked actually harassment during and outside the working hours. Okay, and he was, let's say, invited to resign. So, because otherwise the university would have gone to the police. So basically this was, and I'm going to be quite blunt because I asked at the university, do you have any suggestions about how I should present things? And they said no. My colleague from the working group said, say it as it is. And okay, this is how it was. The university, of course, had some knowledge about this behavior, but nothing was done because I suppose the students were not vocal enough inside this culture of the master, where violence, I think, is many times internalized, where students sometimes, although this might be not a popular thing to say, but sometimes students and alumni actors that I work with, verbalize this, saying that we are used from schools to be treated with violence. You need, as a director, to be more violent. You need to, slash us because it becomes an internalized mechanism. And when the teacher is your teacher, he or she knows best, and you should just be molded. Yes, so that was the history behind this working group, which was created on a voluntarily and self-promoting basis. Teachers were invited to apply to be part of this working group, and some external experts were invited. And we had an agenda. There were 4 points that we needed to address: a code of ethics, which we are working on at the moment; psychological counseling for the students, but it was defined as finding resources for free psychological counseling, which is hilarious. Now you should be able to somehow find the resources in the university to make sure the students have access to that. And yes, this will be happening. Other activities such as workshops, and we have been doing some awareness initiatives, and we will be doing a series of workshops, and an internal audit, which we made in the form of a survey for students, and we are planning on creating a survey for teachers as well. However, I think there are many similarities between our position as a working group in Romania and other initiatives in Poland, for example, because basically the theater schools in Romania as well as in Poland are based on this, and probably I think the Czech Republic, they are based on this hierarchical system where there is this master and there are the apprentices. And this model, I think, is inertial and somehow very resistant, and it's not a model that is ended somehow after the studies and the faculty stays the same and the students enter the workforce. It's a model that somehow translates into the professional market. And I will give an example for that. I hope I'm coherent. I don't know. Maybe you ask me things, because there are so many things to say about the group and about the professional and artistic context in Romania. But recently there have been 2, I will now say 2 stories, 2 anecdotes that I think enlighten this discussion about this model and how it goes, it floats outside of the school and then permeates the professional life. And also about the fact that it's hard to question a model that you have inherited and that comes from, of course, socialism and the Russian theater schools and so on, because many teachers in Romania have been formed in this tradition. So, yeah. Okay, so first anecdote. Recently, our school produced a performance based on the Lucifer Effect, which is a book documenting the Stanford experiment. It could have been done in many ways. It has been done in a way that I and some people in the working group, Ethics and Academic Integrity, consider not so fit. There is a lot of nudity that is debatable. Of course, a lot of humiliation, because it's a performance about the evil in humanity and about how every one of us, given the opportunity, will probably humiliate somebody else, which is a thesis we might or not agree with. We might see it fit, that is reproduced or not. The problem is that nothing deconstructs this violence in the performance. So basically it is based on a cathartic reaction of the audience, and somehow, yes, it works. After witnessing the performance, people will probably feel very burdened and emotionally aggressed, but not because the artistic discourse in the performance deconstructs this violence per se. So it's merely shown. It's merely representational, let's say. This was an argument that we tried somehow to bring it, and there was this idea of creating a post-performance Q&A or round table discussing about basically directing, because it's a choice of directing and how you choose to create an artistical discourse, but it was not met with enthusiasm or anything, because people just didn't see the problem. For example, the faculty dean said, I think the aesthetics of the performance are very, very well established. Where is the problem? So this is the problem. The problem is that people don't see the problem in reproducing things. I don't know how we could approach this. It seems like a very sophisticated argument and something that might be discussed with the directing students that I work with. The actors involved in this performance were taken care of in the sense that they had to sign contracts in the beginning, where they expressed their agreement to taking part in the rehearsals, and they were able to give up and say, okay, I don't want to be part of this at any point. But of course they didn't, because for them, presenting themselves in such a way is in a way empowering, because they are educated and taught that they need to be out there and to put themselves out there. And in a way, I understand why they believe that. However, I think the discussion around this could be very useful. And the second anecdote that relates to what happens to people once they graduate and they become artists. How will their discourse be perceived if it's a discourse that is against the mainstream, or a discourse that the mainstream sees as threatening? And now, I will very quickly, again, the discussion is very long, but again, a very recent scandal. In Romania, there is Uniter, which is the theater union. They award annual prizes. They are the most important prizes. Everybody wants these prizes. They are given to important directors. Maybe you heard about Silviu Purcărete. He's famous. He is internationally known. He was nominated, for example, alongside other people. One of them was Andrei Joldac. Maybe you're familiar with him. He's Ukrainian, and in Romania he was involved in another scandal 5 years back, when during rehearsals he aggressed one of the actresses in a break during a performance. And it doesn't matter what he did. He didn't slap her. They say he just I don't know, grabbed her by the collar, because of course he was not happy with the acting, so it was basically part of the process. At the moment there was a boycott of the performance. There was no official complaint filed by the actress, and he was just sanctioned by 5% of his fee. So that was the official position of the theater. This is enough. He's a great artist. The show must go on. The performance is very good. Okay. And of course, it's the right of a theater manager to decide how the collaborators are picked and who is invited to direct. Okay, fast forward to 2022. He was, of course, invited later on to direct in Romania, because he's a great artist. He creates these very visual 80s, 90s performances that are highly praised and that are nominated and get the prizes. And he did a performance that was nominated. I saw it and I agree with it. It was okay. It was artistically and aesthetically. The actress was very good. She was also nominated. Once the nominations came out, there was a petition that was signed by a group of artists against this nomination. And many people signed it. I mean, a few, maybe 30, 40 people signed it. It was put on the internet. People are still signing it, although the response came back. A petition asking for this director, for Joldac, to be removed from the competition based on his behavior, and basically because he's an abuser. Also, there were other complaints. Why the independent scene is not present in the nominations? Because all the nominations, or most of them, were for mainstream theaters. So for national theaters, state theaters, no independent companies, although there have been cases in the past where the independent scene has been nominated. Also, the representation of women. Why are there no women nominated for the best directing or best performance prize? Okay. And everybody waited for a response from the jury, and they have, I think yesterday, because they needed some time to take it all in, the initial reply was, we were not familiar with his abuse, and anyway, he's a great artist. And basically the reply was this: the jury operates solely on the basis of the aesthetical or artistic quality of the work, so he is free to continue and probably be nominated. Okay, a former collaborator of the secret police in Romania, however, was removed. He will not be given the prize for the entire activity. So this one, okay, this is something serious. I mean, we take this seriously. But the abuse, no, just slapping somebody in 2000, I don't know. That goes. And also, what's the main conclusion is that there is a very divided, I think, scene in Romania, because the way that this mainstream has perceived this petition and this whole actually argument of taking ethics into consideration is being seen as, and here I quote, like woke, pertaining to cancel culture, aggressive. So yeah. So what I want to say is that there are these very clear sides. In one side, just being a good artist and being an artist that brings nomination and prizes is enough and is all there is needed. And the other side, which is really looked at as if they are a group of frustrated young people that are not given prizes, is this group that I am representing here today. Truly, the group of frustrated. Thank you. So yeah, for me, this, I mean, I'm trying to just observe things neutrally, but I also have this ethical dilemma as a teacher, as somebody that works with directing students. Is it ethical for me to brainwash them by asking questions about ethics and representation and the responsibility of the artist? Or should the faculty just bring in some fine men that know, really, I'm really having this dilemma right now, I don't know how I will solve it, because when training students, they need to be prepared for what their professional life will be once they graduate, and at this point it looks very bleak in a way. I hope things will change. I mean, there are vocal groups, at least this, and at least people united and wrote this common petition, and it did something. It just showed these two sides very clearly. Yeah, and Silviu Purcărete, that is 72, wrote this letter online about giving up his nomination because he's too old, and he's going to allow the young female lionesses to reclaim art. So everything is so poetical and divided that is almost fun to be part of the Romanian theatrical landscape today. More anecdotes are available, should you be interested. And I just want to say that I'm really proud of my working group and of these initiatives, because they have to face, very aggressive attitudes that are, of course, indebted to a fear of change. Because if you have been working as a professor for a number of years, you fear that, again, these women, because we are perceived like these crazy women in the working group, they will tell us that it is not allowed to show my students something by touching them. So there is this fear of creating maybe very rigid boundaries that we are trying to deal with. And we will, and I think this difference of opinions is normal and necessary, but it would be just great if we could maybe just take into account the other's perspective and not have this perspective of, oh, you say something against me just because you have a different way of looking at things. So I will just take my toys and leave the, I don't know, the nominations or whatever is at stake. Thank you.
And thank you so much to all of you for giving us this so rich and diverse picture of our struggle, our activity, and I really can feel very strong sense of our post-communist community. So we have much in common, really. But, well, I think the best thing is now to just open the discussion, because I'm sure you have a lot of questions. But I'll take this privilege that I have mic for a second. I will just ask very first question. And I would like to address to the question of representation that had been discussed in the previous panel. In the question of representation when it comes to the actors, who can represent whom and why, and what is behind that question, because I think it's really in the heart of the definition of the understanding of acting and maybe theater even. So I know it's kind of huge, but let's try to address to the main issues. I know from people from London that you've been kind of touched by the conversation that we had before, so maybe I'll ask you first to address to these issues, if you
I was very struck by that discussion in the previous panel around representation, and I think for me, what's very interesting, and one of the things that I do at Central is teach acting, but also teach critical thinking for master's acting students. And it's interesting when we have these discussions about who can play what, that we're even thinking in terms of rules in that way, like who can do this, who can do that. The mind goes straight to like the most rigid scenario, as opposed to thinking about the relations that would determine how somebody would play something or not. And for me, I find that there's anxiety from both teachers, directors, and students about this question. There's always this question about, am I allowed to play this? And I think to myself, well, actually, ultimately, you have to answer that for yourself, because there's no authority that's going to be telling you whether you're allowed to do something or not. Simply, you need to think about your encounter as a human being with a role, and what that stands for and what that means. Like that's that moment of substitution in the theater, or surrogation, as Joseph Roach says, that if you're, one body standing in for another, that's that moment of transformation in the theater, but it also means something to the different people in the audience, and you're going to have to be the person who takes responsibility for that. There is actually no authority that you can pass that responsibility on to. So those questions are going to be fundamental for the actor. You can blame the director all you want, but actually you're going to be the person taking that heat. So the question needs to come back to the actors, and it needs to be discussed ultimately, because they're the ones who are going to be taking responsibility for their action and what they're doing. So I think that when we start thinking of, I really appreciated the conversation around representation in the last panel, but I think if we're thinking in terms of rules and wanting some external authority to put that rule on us, like that's not going to happen. Actually, we need to be thinking in terms of ethics. How do we act in this situation, and what are the reasons for doing that, and then stand behind that thing. So I think that that's like very important for something that I try to instill in my students. And it's something that I, for myself, when I tell this story to all of my students, but back in when I was at university in Vancouver, I, who am not Mexican, I played Pablo in Streetcar Named Desire, who is a Mexican character. I wouldn't do that today. Unless there was some thinking in terms of the production that allowed me to encounter that role in a way that brought myself to that role. But I wasn't doing that in that earlier production, and therefore, for me, my ethics have changed, and I wouldn't do that today. So I think that developing that is like a key skill for our training, for our education. So that the actors are going to ultimately have to do that, and we can't just be like anybody can play anything, because that's like a rule that's not going to exist anywhere else in the world, right? So they're not going to encounter that. It's not something realistic, so therefore we need to instill that critical thinking skill in our educational practices as well.
So I think for me, actually, I'm not going to talk about representation in acting, because there was something from that panel that struck me that I wanted to discuss, and obviously it's related. But I just think the way we talk about trans people as if they're not humans with feelings that don't deserve accommodations made for them, I felt that was quite sad to see. And I understand that we're all at different levels of education, I'm not going to say acceptance, but, you know, our learning about different identities and respect, yeah. And I just felt that when we recognise trans people as human beings like us, equal to us, then we can start to treat them as if how they deserve to be treated. And I always talk about humanising people's experiences, and my work with trans people over the years has really allowed me to understand the point. Before trans people come out, most of them have considered suicide, and I think it's so relevant to remember that it takes a great deal of courage to stand up and be who you are, and spaces need to provide psychological safety for that. So to say, you know, we have trans people in our community, but it's fine. We don't know if it's fine unless we're asking them. And we shouldn't be inviting trans people into spaces that aren't safe for them or anywhere near safe. So I think for me, that's what I took from the conversation, and I didn't want to leave without expressing that.
Well, so to my limited knowledge, I think there's no ongoing discussion about this representation in acting at theatre faculty department. Maybe I'm mistaken, but there's a very, I don't know, I don't want to say that the community itself in Damu is not very diverse. It is. There are males and females, people of different ages and different social backgrounds. But what I'm trying to do now, it's just to accommodate the space for people with disabilities, because if you have theater plays about people with disabilities, and there are such a plays which were already premiered in the Czech Republic, so we introduced the system for accommodation of people with disabilities and students with disabilities at DAMU last December, like 4 months ago. And now I'm having open conversations with people in the different departments. What does it mean to have a disability? Do you have students with disability? How do you recognize, how do you communicate with people who have, for instance, schizophrenia or depression and things like that? And so we are at the very beginning of that. And there's one anecdotal issue as well about trans people. The former head of the acting, or it's called like drama section at the National Theatre in Prague, came out as a trans woman after the students' initiative. It had a lot of impact on them when you have to speak out your true identity and what you lived during your studies. And there was again heated debate about how come. Why now? The people questioning the decision and the identity of the person publicly. So we have to talk a lot at DAMU about these issues, and and I'm happy to be part of that. But they have to find the solution themselves. I'm the mediator. I'm someone who will give them the path and choices and experts. But we have to speak with the people and invite them on the faculty and to destigmatize all these thoughts and patterns.
Yeah, I also think that we don't talk enough about representation in acting or in art generally. But I was thinking now, and this idea also was mentioned in the panels earlier, in the first panel. I think maybe we do not discuss representation because we do not feel it's a problem, because the represented categories in dramaturgy are really the same. I mean, if you're just working on Shakespeare without approaching it critically and deconstructing it, then what questions about representations should we ask? You know, so I think. Yeah, I think representation goes hand in hand with the critique of the canon in a way. I for example, discussed this with the students because in Romania we have, not very large, but we have a Roma minority and we have a very unique Roma feminist theater company. And I discussed with the students this issue of representation in relation to this company that do a lot of work of self-representing their issues, which when done by somebody else, because there have been other performances done by non-Roma directors with non-Roma actors, yeah, can be problematic. But I think it's yeah, an issue that is really not addressed yet.
So actually the same here. We are at the beginning of this conversation, and 2 days ago we had very important one on our Senate, and I think we've managed to make a small step for to change this definition of actor's body as a kind of perfect universal tool who is trained to represent everyone actually, and that's the very heart of actor's art. But yes, but we are in this conversation, I feel, at the very beginning, but I feel that we are opening right now. That's something that we are, you know, embracing step by step in all this stage of changes. Okay, I think if you have any questions, comments, need statements, manifestos, now it's a moment for you to ask questions. I think I will give maybe Wojtek and then...
Hi, Wojtek Zemilski. I'm a lecturer here and also doing my PhD at Central. I have a question for the representatives of Royal Central School of Speech and Drama. What are the problems you're facing now? Because from what you've just been saying, it looks like you are the ultimate goal, at least from our Central Eastern perspective. Like it's, you know, the ultimate solution is there. What are the struggles? What are the tensions that are keeping you busy right now?
I think, you know, we're doing the work, definitely. I think the more transparency you have, the more open people become, and sometimes the more incidents come to the surface. So we still have ongoing things that we deal with. I just hope it means that we've got a culture where people feel that they are able to speak up and that they can trust that they will feel supported in doing so. I think some of the things that we talked about, you know, discussing anti-Semitism is very new for us in an open way at Central, and that work is ongoing, and we're at the beginning of that journey, and we're all learning together. And we will hear about some of the other, well, we'll hear the journey about where we've come from and where we are now. But did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think when we present what we're doing, any school presenting what they're doing in a positive light, it does sound like things are moving forward. But one of the things that I'll sort of follow up on in my keynote a bit later is just people not necessarily like a form of resistance, but people hearing themselves out of needing to change. I think that that's one of the things that and it's very subtle, and it can happen in a kind of a very subtle way, where everybody will agree that, you know, we need to change X, Y, and Z in the curriculum. Then it comes down to, okay, so we need to get rid of something in order to make space for something else. And then that just doesn't happen, because there's a number of excuses that for any number of reasons why. And I think that that kind of ongoing critical interrogation, like a kind of truly interrogative, like the next stage of the work, I think that that's the problem that we're facing now. So I do think in many ways we're through that initial crisis period, but actually the next stage is actually the harder one, because it's the one that is about the longer lasting change, that is about what theater do we want to make in the future, because we can't keep making it the same way. I will add that another kind of related thing that we're facing is just a kind of hostile environment from government, from state, from the media around efforts towards inclusion, diversity, and equity. And I think that the amount of we know, well, for those of you who don't know, the media environment in the UK is heavily transphobic, right? So the kinds of things that are talked about in terms of gender identity in the media make it really difficult to have that conversation in the school when there is such hostility from the outside world. So that, as an external environment, that's very difficult for us to navigate right now. Because the moment when we felt like it was such a necessity it is a necessity, still there. That driver, that motivation, still there. But now we're facing a just hostility from the external world.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hi, Ulla Kiek again. Thank you very much for your presentations. I was very moved by your story about the auditioning to theatre schools. And my question is to all of you, but it's a little bit connected with your experience, but it's more about the conversation about neurodivergency and neuroatypical types of people, and we are starting to talk about it in different contexts. How not all of us have a feeling of that I have a right to be here, and the imposter syndrome, and that not all of us have a kind of a background to be perceived as a self-confident person and to go and fight for work and for the role or for the project or something. And I am just wondering if it's a topic for you, like in education, how can we make it maybe a little bit easier for people who are some kind of neurodivergent something? Is there anything that you do, or is there anything you see that can be done? Also with connection that a person can be a victim and a perpetrator at the same time, not willingly or willingly. It's really complicated, I know.
Thank you. That's a really great question, actually, because neurodivergence is a vested interest for me. I think at Central, we always have ongoing conversations about neurodiversity. We have a number of things we're trying to put into place at the moment, like accessibility training, digital accessibility training. We're currently going through a process of trying to make all of our PDFs accessible, all of our Word documents, everything that we do digitally. We have a really good neurodiversity and disability team that support our students. They're very passionate about their work. They support staff as well, which I don't think they're actually is part of their role, but they tend to do that anyway. And so, yeah, in terms of teaching, perhaps Broderick is best to speak to that as an academic. But what I will say is it's something that we discuss all the time. We're trying to put things into place so that there is just one process and not a neurotypical process, and then on the side we're going to do something for neurodivergent people. We want it to be the mainstream, and we want everything to be as accessible as possible. And we're always open to these conversations. Yeah, so did you want to add to that?
Well, I think you said it very well, and I think in terms of teaching, it's about inclusion from the point of design, so making it universally accessible. What we want to avoid is, alternatives in terms of assessment for if you have any sort of accessibility need. It doesn't have to be neurodivergence, but that. It's difficult though, because I don't think that historically there isn't the training for that in British higher education, and I can't speak for other countries, but in terms of how we as academics typically our training is doing a PhD or doing MFA or some, a kind of large project, but that training doesn't really extend to teacher training in the way that it should. And historically, that's not been there. So I think when we're doing a massive job of catching up at the moment, because we recognize now that needs to be done.
Sorry, I forgot to say, we have actually recently set up an accessibility working group that looks at both physical and neurological disabilities. It's actually chaired by our principal, and I co-chair it as well. And that group is represented across all departments of the school, and also has some external representation of people that work in the industry in disability. And so, we're just using that to inform what we're doing moving forward. So I think that was a really important point I didn't want to miss out, actually. And there's a lot of work that's been done. The accessibility working group is new, so we're at the beginning of the journey with this. And I think what it will basically do is just hold us accountable and streamline all of our processes.
Hello. Hi, my name is Szymon Adamczak. Is it my turn? Yes. Okay. Yeah, I'm part of a panel on Friday, a queer panel, so please come. I wanted to first thank you very much for addressing also the trans conversation in the room. I find it quite peculiar as well, but as someone who's now running a practice-based research for supporting queer and trans artists in Amsterdam, and also someone who works in Poland, let's say having a LGBT agenda on my own. I'm wondering also, I was just working with queer young adults and trans adults with professional actors on stage. And what was very striking for me was that one of the trans guys actors is actually someone who would like to become a student of theater academy. And while we were developing the work, there was this kind of momentum where okay, in these processes of becoming a man, or also being psychologically assessed to be one, or I see that's feasible, but what he is not, let's say, what is not rendered feasible for him is becoming an actor and having a career, and that really struck me, and somehow I wanted to kind of say it again in a way. But what I wanted to say about actors or acting training was I found very interesting then that I'm wondering because in Polish theater at least, or Polish theater context, we do have quite an approach to bring non-professionals to theater, to ensemble work, or meet ensembles of theaters with non-professional actors and so on. So what we've discovered, what we kind of assessed was very interesting. We started to see also professionally trained or acting trained people as those who can be so-called like professional people. And in this case, like the representation was left to the devices of people who can self-represent and auto-represent themselves, and actors become in relationship. It's one thing, but also in sort of a supportive function. So how an actor can transmit training to a non-professional body in order for them to rehearse their identity and sense of self. So this is a kind of something that I wanted to kind of bring into the room. But having said all of that, let's say coming from more of a queer perspective, like listening to the conversation of representation, I'm also thinking like, hey, but representation is also not liberation. So then my question is also like to you, because like in my practice, like I'm wondering how can we stretch or understand, let's say, theatrical spaces as civic spaces. So how can you address, or how do you address, let's say, a sense of citizenship among your students, and how do you relate to something that has not yet been mentioned today, which is class?
I need a moment.
What I will say, when I talk about palatability, that does refer to class as well. And I think it's important that we don't bring our preconceived ideas of how people should be to our work or however we're interacting with people. So that was one of the key things, I think. I don't really understand why in drama schools and theatre there's so much resistance, because everything is pretty much, over the years I've noticed that everything seems to be pretty much the same. Is it not boring? Can we not celebrate people for who they are and see what they're bringing to the table? And yeah.
I think that the conversation about class in particular in the UK, where it is so marked, right, and it's one of those things where it's like constantly talked about as well. In terms of, I think that there's a study recently about the amount of working class people from a working class background who work in the arts in general, but then also actors, where the representation of working classness in the British theaters, has a kind of very long history, but it typically tends to be people who are not from working class backgrounds who end up doing that representing and doing that world, and that's unsolvable without changing the material context of the educational system in the UK at this present moment, and that has to be a kind of massive shift with the way that universities and conservatoires and drama schools are funded. It needs to be a change, and this is like it's very the moment when the tuition fees in the UK jumped to £9,000 a year was the first year that I was a lecturer in the UK, and that was now 12 years ago now, right? It's the historical forgetting that you can do about that. It's so naturalized that is the tuition fee at this point, that it's really, really difficult to think about those alternatives. So the change is not at least in terms of class, which intersects, of course, with race and other protected characteristics and identities, is not going to change without material thinking about the way that we do this training. So I guess like that civic. I think what's interesting, the UK is also going through a period of industrial action in all levels. There is varying levels of support from students around that industrial action. But I think one of the things that we need to remember for actors is that when you graduate, you immediately become part of a trade union, at least in the UK. Like, you get student equity membership. Equity is a trade union. There is a civic responsibility to being part of that, whether, at the bare minimum, just even the paying of dues, right? So like that is going to be part of your working professional life. And I think often it's treated as a membership in a club as opposed to a responsibility to the community of workers that you are going to be a part of. So that would be a shift that needs to happen. That's going to be a longer conversation for us, but a really important one in the UK context.
Like we will have the conversation about the curriculum this year and the next year. So, and when I handle complaints concerning workload of students, there's always a discussion about like we have many hours in the school, and then we already are involved in the production, and I have to work. So, and that's where the protected ground of class enters in my agenda, for instance. So definitely we have to do some survey of how many students, for instance, of DAMU actually a part of studying and working for theater productions also work in the supermarket just to pay their like living costs. So we have to take into account when we do the amendment of the curriculum. So, and there's not unanimous decision yet, but some pedagogues really still consider that this should not be taken into account, that these people just were admitted to study, so they have to study and nothing else is interesting in that particular respect. So.
Hello, hi. I'm Agnieszka Jakimiak, and I'm a theatre maker and also a PhD student at Royal Holloway, University of London, and I don't pay for my studies. I have a studentship. So, and it's pretty normal for me because I'm from Poland, so I think that the whole discussion about class is very different for us in Poland and post-communist bloc where high education is for free. So whenever I go to London, everybody is so shocked that I take it for granted that I don't pay for my studies. So, but anyway, I wanted to thank you so much for your output, and also I found it extremely interesting, especially in the context also about in the context of representation. I didn't participate in the previous panel, so I didn't witness the previous discussion, but I think it is a huge issue. And also I really appreciate what you mentioned about these rigid examples that we usually turn into during the discussions, because also in Poland it is very common that in a discussion about representations, actors say, yeah, I should be able to like play whoever I want, even if it is like a completely different background in terms of ethnicity and also like in terms of, I don't know, sexual orientation and so on. And in fact, we don't have so many examples in plays and in performances of such roles. So it is always bringing the discussion to this dead end where we are just like showing different weird examples that have like no representation in reality, in fact. But I wanted to ask you about the audition process, because you also mentioned the process of like applying to theater academy, and I really appreciated what you said about like these preconceptions that we already have when we are like 19, 20, and sometimes we reproduce these cliché stereotypes already at that point. And we tend to think that the process of auditioning is always harmful, and I just wanted to ask you whether you know like what is the best possible way in UK context, but also in the context of Czech Republic and Romani theater, if there is like a right way how to conduct a process of auditioning for a specific performance, but also to a theater academy.
I'll just start by saying one of the biggest barriers for me when auditioning was the cost of auditions. I limited myself to 6 schools. It cost me over £300. I was a single parent, and I don't really know how I did it, to be honest. And that's such a big barrier for so many people. So we do offer some free auditions, don't we? And I think that's really helped, especially when we consider class, socioeconomic background, and access to get into drama school. I think that was one of the big things that I noticed had changed when I came to Central. I don't know about other drama schools.
And then another thing that I think is really important is just diversifying the panel itself, because if you wouldn't have a panel of all white men for a job interview, then you shouldn't have it for auditions, right? So that is it's just like a very straightforward thing, but I think that that can be a real, it can make a real difference in terms of students' experience encountering, you know, people who share their background in the room and just the face that they would recognize, you know. And so in doing that, I think you can make real change. The other thing I think is just remembering that these are they're young people who are doing this, and that there's no other equivalent to that in a lot of higher education systems. Usually you just send your application and you get told yes or no. So you don't have to have an interview for most other subjects in higher education, or at least not in the UK, you know. And in the same way that I think things like the Oxford and Cambridge interview will need to change at some point. Like, I think that auditions, we need to remember that these are young people who are putting themselves out there straight out of school, and this could be the first experience of rejection, and quite violent rejection, that they encounter. And we can justify that all you want by thinking about, oh, the industry is like that, and it's like, well, but we need to change that aspect of things too, because once you get into the industry, what an audition becomes is a whole bunch of unpaid labor that is extremely stressful. And I remind people that, or remind students that, like, an audition in terms of the levels of stress, this might be anecdotal, but they say that it's the same amount as like a car accident. So like an audition has the same level of cortisol stress hormone in the body as being in a car accident, but people don't get into 52 car accidents in 1 year, right? So the levels, I think just being conscious of that, you know, is one of the things that we can make a very fun and an enjoyable environment for students at auditions, rather than thinking about them as like this kind of cattle call selection, yes, no.
Yeah, I would say, I think, yeah, in Romania, we don't have such a competitional environment, let's say, and people that usually want to enter a theater school and enter it at a certain point. Auditions for roles, also they are less frequent because the theater community is quite small. Directors usually work with a certain company, so very rarely, it's not really dynamic. But I was thinking now that, and that's related to what Agata was saying, I think auditions could be made less as a selection of individuals that look in a certain way and have all the talents, because an actor somehow is valuable if they have like these extra skills. Can they sing? Can they dance? Can they tap dance? Oh, they know how to play an instrument. He's in. You know, teachers already think they're casting for the school productions in a way, you know, really. They're like, who's gonna play? Who's gonna be Masha? Who's going to be, really, they are really thinking. Of course, they need to have in mind a certain dynamic. They need to, I don't know, they need to have something in mind when picking their class, but maybe think less about these shoulds and, yeah, shoulds. A woman, yeah, the body, the objectification of women. Why must an actress be skinny and have long hair? I don't think so. I mean, I think the auditions should reflect, and what is represented should reflect the diversity of the world that we live in, that is not so standardized anymore. And if theater always lags behind, then I think this is one of the reasons that theater, I'm not going to say is dying, but can become very quickly irrelevant if it lags behind and it just pushes forward the same faces and the same representations, because it's a museum then.
Hello, my name is Joanna, and first of all, I'd like to think about the example of critical thinking classes, because I think this is something Polish schools, theater schools need very much, and I apply for introducing such classes here in the academy, because the previous discussion and all the discussions about Polish theater schools show me that students need this a lot, plus a lot of empowerment. But my question is based on some reflection that I want to share with you. The general problem of higher education is how to predict what will be needed in the market in 5 years. So what jobs will be, what skills will be needed for future jobs. And in 2013, Heiner Goebbels gave a speech in Lublin, here in Festival, and there's also a text made of the speech about how to educate for theater. And he made this thesis that the theater is, the current European theater is 100-year-old constructions, and theater schools are just the end chain of it, and it reproduces itself in this old sort of theater by educating students for the old kind of theater. And he postulated, of course, to allow students to be creative for themselves. But my question is there a reflection in your schools? How can they be the agent of changing the theater, or how can they train students for the future theater, not for the past theater that we have on the stages? And is this sort of transformation that we are here talking about a part of this change? Heiner Goebbels meant, of course, aesthetics, but maybe the social or psychological side is better to prepare students for the future theater than just pure art, so to say. And I'm also interested about the reflection from the Polish school, not only from European colleagues. So what are your thoughts, reflections? How can the theater school prepare students for the future theater?
I can say that me and Veronika, we're gonna speak about it tomorrow. So if you can be here, all of you, really, really welcome. It's a huge, huge conversation. And I think we have the very dynamic situation in Poland right now that actually we have kind of, let's say, progressive theater, you know. Some of them, few of them, and we mostly concentrate on them. Mostly of critics is about, you know, from, I don't know, 10, maybe 15 theaters in Poland are present in the debate. We have 120 public theaters, actually. So there are very different dynamics. Yeah, that's the public culture. Yeah, it's something very different, and they are public. They are subsidized by the state and so on and so on. And we pay for the tickets, but you know, not not really much, actually. So what I was trying to say that when you are asking about the theater of the future, what is it? First is a huge debate. Let's think about it. Yes, let's have open mind and let's think about it. But even now, we have this, let's say, I will stay with this progressive theaters. And for example, they need very different skills, very different capacities, very different approach to acting than the rest, let's say, more traditional theater. So even now, it's a huge challenge for the school. For what theaters we are educating. Because I really feel we need this very deep debate about how do we teach and why and for what kind of theater and for what kind of society. It's not just a question of theater for me. It's much wider question. But it needs just deep and complicated debate. I'm sorry, it's very disappointing answer. I know, but tomorrow I'm gonna try be a bit more specific. But thank you for this question. And again, we started this conversation. We are at the very beginning. How to change curriculum, how to change the definition of what we need theater for. You know, if you start asking this question, then you know bigger and bigger perspective is coming. That's all what I can say.
Outside aesthetics, I think a possible answer, something that we are intuitively maybe trying to teach the students is not to think of their professional itinerary as being very linear, because they're not going to graduate and then be hired by a state theater. That happens very, very rarely in Romania because most of them are full and they only have openings once some years. So we try really, it is how it is, but that's not a problem because the independent scene has been quite dynamic in the last decade. Actually today, Bractor, which is this independent performing arts company from Cluj that created all the scandal, celebrates its 9th year, I think, of activity. So already there are independent companies that are surviving. So what we are trying to tell students that they will need to self-manage their careers. So that means they need to be able to apply for funds, to create NGOs or companies. Yeah, just prepare them for the real life where you need to fight for subsidies. And in a way this works because, of course, in big cities such as Cluj, there are some companies that absorb some of the students. So I think this is one way of preparing them for the future, at least for a philosophy of uncertainty and being proactive.
So Central has quite a lot of courses, and I think one of the things about that is that the diversity and range of courses means that there are some that are really training students as makers, creating the kind of future of theater, and there are also, and then there are more traditional courses, for want of a better word. But in a way, we're all the same community, and I think one of the interesting concepts and very important concepts that I'm taking away from this conference already is this idea of market paternalism, which was used in the opening report and presentation, which in some ways I feel has been so internalized by everyone in the community. Actually, it's like students and teachers, and because we'll talk about it in different guises, like employability and and thinking about like, well, what transferable skills do you have? And so I don't really have an answer in terms of what Central is doing, and I think that we could only dream about the amount of subsidies in terms of the British theater that other places in Europe have. One of the things that, because you mentioned Heiner Goebbels, and I know that one of the most transformative experiences for me as an actor and a performer was actually performing at the Discourse Festival in Gießen. I forget which university actually holds it. Justus Liebig, is it? So that was so incredible because it's like an undergraduate theater department that creates this a festival of the scale and experimentalism and importance of that seasoned artists are doing in the UK. And I found that level of trust in the students incredibly inspiring at that time. So that was 2012 when I performed in that festival. And for me and my artistic partner at that time, coming from the UK into that environment it was just like, oh, this is it. This is the future here. So I'm hoping that energy still exists in that department, in that festival, but I don't know. But that struck me as being something that was really beautiful and wonderful to see.
I think just don't train students under the cis-het white gaze. I think that's a good place to start.
So just quick response, there are 3 different departments in Prague faculty who teaches acting actually, and I think one is very traditional and the other one is puppet and alternative, and the third one is authorial acting. So I think that settings brings more diversity in terms of what do you say, what is the theater for future, and now the DAM was discussing a lot of issues concerning the space and theater space, because traditional theater, which is within the building, serves more for traditional performances than for alternative and authorial acting. So the faculty is searching a new space to be more open, more diverse, more different, let's say, which is a good example of how the faculty is thinking about different approaches to theater. I don't know at which level they are now in the discussions and negotiations, but I'm seeing that there are working groups and there's a very open discussions about that. And also I'm seeing that the Vice Dean for Studies is bringing also some tools to students, like how to make a startup, how to make how to become more independent, how to make independent production if I want to be different than the current settings or current scenes in Prague and different cities in the Czech Republic. So I think that yeah, there is discussion. I don't know. Maybe I can provide you then some context and you can check it with my partners and faculty.
Hi. Hello. Sorry. Hi. I'm Tony. I'm from the Academy of Theatre and Dance in Amsterdam, and I just wanted to say that I really appreciate that all of you bring your situated knowledges to the place, and it makes me think of sort of the importance of aligning our struggles with each other, because what is also very clear from this whole conference is that theatre schools are in a lot of trouble and we need to learn a lot of new things. And I was wondering if you could speculate a bit on sort of the possibilities of standing in solidarity with each other and what could arise from there. You were mentioning Kim Tolbe earlier, and there's this whole concept of standing with, but that's only, yeah, sort of, I was wondering about what might be ways how we could be in solidarity with each other to effect changes on a broader level.
I don't know. I think it's an issue that we should think about for whole 3 days, and maybe have an answer at the end. There will be another 1 hour for closing conference, and I think it's a great, issue for us to talk about it in 3 days. I just wanted to say that we have to finish because we have another presentation, and Broderick is giving the presentation, so he needs some rest between. Answering shortly, I saw this protest of you don't have to endure this, and for example, we immediately contact students from Prague. We were in conversation. We sent a lot of our materials. We met them many times online. We organized debate here to give them visibility. So we've been in contact in many different schools. I'm watching other guys. So it's happening. But definitely, maybe it's time to go to more. I don't know, organized step, let's say. And we have these 3 days, let's use it for it. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, there's also like European network of ombudsperson for higher education, and this year there's a conference in Prague, accidentally, which will be focused on art schools and art higher education. So there will be also discussion on that. I think that the ombudspersons of higher education from all around Europe can think about some possible steps forward in terms of solidarity and bringing the same cause to relevant stakeholders and possibly make a change on the ground.
Thank you, everyone. It's just the beginning of this conference, and let's have a break, and we are meeting here at 6 again. Thank you.